The voicemail came through at 11:40 on a Tuesday night. I was already in bed, reading on my tablet, when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. Unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail, then realized it already had. I tapped the notification. Static, background noise. Then a woman's voice, faint but distinct, saying 4 words, "This is Carol Brennan." My mother's name. The message continued. "I'm trying to reach my daughter Rachel. If you get this message, please call back." Then a phone number spoken slowly, carefully. Then the line went dead. I sat up, my heart pounding. I played it again. The voice was older, raspier than I remembered, but the cadence was unmistakable. The way she said my name, Rachel, with a slight emphasis on the second syllable. My mother died 12 years ago. I was 28. She'd had a stroke while I was traveling for work. My father had called me from the hospital, told me she was gone before I could get there. We'd held a funeral. I'd given a eulogy. I'd watched them lower her casket into the ground. I stared at the phone, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. A scam, identity theft, AI voice cloning. There were a dozen rational explanations, but none of them explained why the voice sounded so much like her. I saved the voicemail and tried calling the number back. It rang 4 times, then disconnected. No voicemail. No answering service. I tried again. Same result. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark, replaying the message over and over, listening for anything that might tell me it wasn't real. But every time I heard her say my name, something inside me fractured a little more. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was a mistake, a cruel prank, maybe someone who'd known her, someone with access to old recordings. I didn't tell anyone. I went to work, managed my schedule, answered emails, attended meetings. I was a senior project coordinator for a nonprofit, 40 years old, recently divorced, no children. My life was predictable, structured, exactly the way I'd built it after my mother died. But that voicemail sat in my phone like a splinter I couldn't remove. My mother's death had been sudden. She'd been 60, too healthy, active. The stroke had come out of nowhere. My father had been the one to find her. Collapsed in their kitchen. By the time the ambulance arrived, it was too late. Or that's what I'd been told. I was in Boston at the time, running a conference for work. My father called me at 6 in the morning. His voice was flat, detached. He said, "Your mother's gone. You need to come home." I'd flown back to Columbus that same day. The funeral arrangements were already underway. My father had handled everything, chose the casket, wrote the obituary, selected the burial plot. He said he wanted to spare me the burden. I'd been grateful at the time. Grief had made everything feel distant and unreal. I'd moved through the wake, the service, the burial like I was watching someone else's life. Afterward, my father had sold the house and moved to Arizona. We talked once a month, brief calls that never went deeper than surface updates. My younger brother Tim lived in Seattle. We exchanged texts on birthdays and holidays but hadn't seen each other in years. We'd all moved on, separately, quietly. Now, 12 years later, I was staring at a voicemail from a woman who sounded exactly like my dead mother. I called my father that weekend. I asked if he'd received any strange calls or messages recently. He said no. I asked if anyone had contacted him about Mom. He said no, why would they? I didn't mention the voicemail. I don't know why. Maybe because I didn't want him to think I was losing my mind. Maybe because something in his voice, flat, careful, made me hesitate. I hired a private investigator instead. Her name was Laura Meeks, a former police detective who'd gone private 5 years ago. I met her at a coffee shop and played her the voicemail. She listened twice. Then she said, "You want me to find out if this is real?" I said, "I want to know who left it and why." She said, "If your mother is alive, this is going to get complicated." I said, "She's not alive. She's been dead for 12 years. Laura said, "Then let's prove that." She started by tracing the phone number. It was a prepaid cell, purchased with cash at a convenience store in Cleveland 3 months ago. No name attached. No usage history except the one call to me. Laura requested my mother's death certificate from the county. It arrived a week later. Cause of death listed as cerebral hemorrhage, signed by a Dr. Howard Vance. Laura looked him up. He'd been a family physician in Columbus, retired in 2018, died in 2020. She said, "Did your mother see Dr. Vance regularly?" I said, I don't know. My father handled all her medical appointments. She said, do you have access to any of her medical records? I said, no. My father would have kept those, she said. Then we need to request them from her insurance company. She filed the request. It took 3 weeks. When the records arrived, they were incomplete. Just routine checkups from the year before she died, nothing about the stroke, nothing from the hospital. Laura said, that's unusual. If she died in a hospital, there should be admission records, treatment notes, a discharge summary. I said, maybe they were lost. She said, or they were never created. She contacted the hospital where my mother supposedly died. They had no record of her being admitted on that date. No record of a Carol Brennan at all. Laura said, either your father took her to a different hospital, or she was never there. I said, where else would he have taken her? Laura said, that's what we're going to find out. She started calling hospitals within a 50-mile radius of Columbus. None of them had records of Carol Brennan being admitted or treated in June 2012. Laura said, I think your father lied about where she died, or when, or if. I said, she had a funeral. I was there. Laura said, did you see the body? I stopped. I tried to remember. The casket had been closed. My father had said it was what she would have wanted. Dignity, privacy. I hadn't questioned it. Laura said, closed casket funerals are common, but they're also easy to fake. I said, why would he fake her death? Laura said, that's what we need to find out. She requested a copy of the burial permit from the cemetery. It took another 2 weeks, but it came back. The permit was signed by my father and a funeral director named Glenn Howell. Laura looked him up. He'd worked for a funeral home in Columbus, retired in 2015, died in 2019. Laura said, 2 people involved in your mother's death are now conveniently dead themselves. I said, what are you saying? She said, I'm saying we should exhume the grave. I filed a petition with the county court. My lawyer, a probate attorney named Janet Ruiz, said it would be difficult. Exhumations required strong evidence of fraud or misidentification. But Laura's findings were enough to get a judge to approve it. The exhumation took place on a cold morning in November. I wasn't allowed to be present, but Janet called me afterward. She said, the casket was empty. I sat down on the floor of my apartment and didn't move for an hour. Janet said, we're filing a formal investigation. The prosecutor's office will be involved. If your father faked your mother's death, there will be criminal charges. I said, where is she? Janet said, we don't know yet, but we're going to find out. Laura traced my father's financial records from 2012. She found monthly payments to a facility called Greenbrook Care Center, a long-term psychiatric hospital in rural Pennsylvania. The payments had started in June 2012, the same month my mother supposedly died. They'd continued until 2020 when my father moved to Arizona. Laura said, I think your mother was committed. I said, be who? Laura said, be your father. She contacted Greenbrook. They confirmed that a Carol Brennan had been a patient there from 2012 to 2021. She'd been transferred to another facility after funding stopped. Laura said, she's alive, and she's been in psychiatric care for 12 years. I flew to Pennsylvania the next day. The facility Carol had been transferred to was called Maplewood Residential, a state-funded home for individuals with long-term mental health needs. I met with the director, a woman named Dr. Ellen Frost. She confirmed that Carol Brennan was a resident. She said Carol had severe memory issues, likely related to trauma or prolonged institutionalization. She said Carol rarely spoke and had no visitors. I said, can I see her? Dr. Frost said, you'll need to be added to her approved contact list. Are you family? I said, I'm her daughter. Dr. Frost pulled up her file. She said, there's no family listed. The admitting party was listed as her legal guardian, a man named Robert Brennan. My father. Dr. Frost said, if you're her daughter, you have the right to visit. But I should warn you, she may not recognize you. She took me to a common room. My mother was sitting by a window, staring outside. She was thin, her hair completely gray, her hands folded in her lap. She looked older than 62. She looked like she'd been erased. I sat down next to her. I said, Mom. She turned slowly. Her eyes were vacant at first. Then something shifted. She said, Rachel? I said, yes. She said, "I've been trying to call you." I started crying. I couldn't help it. She reached out and took my hand. I said, "Why are you here?" She said, "Your father. He said I was sick. He said I needed help. But I wasn't sick, I just wanted to leave." I said, "Leave what?" She said, "Him." She told me she'd been planning to divorce my father. She'd found out he'd been having an affair, hiding money, lying for years. She'd confronted him. He'd told her she was delusional, that she was having a breakdown. He'd taken her to a psychiatrist, Dr. Vance, who was a friend of his. Dr. Vance had signed papers saying she was a danger to herself. My father had her committed, she said. I tried to fight it. But no one believed me. They said I was paranoid. They kept me sedated. After a while, I stopped trying. I said, "Why didn't you try to contact me?" She said, "I did. I wrote letters. I called. But your father told them I wasn't allowed to contact family. He said it would upset me." I said, "I thought you were dead." She said, "I know. That's what he told everyone." I contacted the prosecutor's office. They opened a criminal investigation into my father. They charged him with fraud, false imprisonment, and conspiracy. He was arrested in Arizona and extradited to Ohio. The trial lasted 6 weeks. My father's lawyer argued that he'd acted in my mother's best interest, that she'd been genuinely unstable. But Laura had found evidence. Financial records showing he'd emptied her accounts, emails with his mistress. Testimony from staff at Greenbrook who said my mother had never exhibited dangerous behavior. The jury found him guilty. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison. I moved my mother into an assisted living facility near my apartment. She's been there for 8 months now. Her memory is improving. She's started painting again. We have dinner twice a week. My brother visited once. He didn't know what to say. Neither did I. My father and I don't speak. I don't plan to visit him. I don't plan to forgive him. My mother told me something last week. She said, "I don't hate him. I just feel sorry for him." I said, "How can you say that?" She said, "Because he destroyed his own life trying to control mine." I think about that a lot. About how fear and control can drive someone to erase the person they once loved. About how easy it is to make someone disappear when no one's looking. If you've ever stayed silent long enough to uncover the truth someone buried, you're not alone.